I just want to remind you, because I think some of you remember and some of you probably don't. The day after those attacks, well, immediately after the attacks, actually, Spain at the time had a very right-wing president named José María Aznar. A big Bush ally went into Iraq with Bush against the wishes of his people. Immediately after the attack, Aznar just started doing his best Bush impersonation, which meant using the attack instantly to political advantage, just nakedly. He blamed ETA, the Basque separatists, with no evidence whatsoever. And then he also said, and this is why we're in Iraq, because these people want to take away our freedom, which made no sense. I mean, if it was ETA, then what does it have to do with Iraq? But it was, the free association Bush style. And so people were watching this, and the response was instant. The day after the attacks, Spaniards took to the streets in huge demonstrations. And it's really important to remember how frightening it was to do that in this moment. They didn't know who was behind the attacks, and they were still out there. And so the idea of people gathering, I mean, when you gather together, you're a target, right? And so it was in defiance of fear that people gathered. And in fact, they described the marches as marches not against Aznar, but marches against fear. And it's very interesting, if you think about that idea, to have a march against an emotion. Your emotion, right? An emotion within yourself, identifying the enemy within. And the enemy within is fear. And then it just so happened, lucky them, that they were having elections the next day, the day after that. And people were able to instantly act on their rejection and their disgust at the way these events were being exploited. And they voted overwhelmingly against Aznar's party and voted in Zapatero, who was promising, running on a platform of pulling troops out of Iraq. And they did pull troops out of Iraq. Imagine that. And So when we were in Spain, I asked a lot of people, why was it that people responded so spontaneously, so without any organization, so powerfully to what Aznar was doing? And we got the same answer again and again. Aznar reminded us of Franco. And so what's so interesting about that story, to me, is first of all that they identified fear as their enemy, even though they had every reason to be afraid, right? There is no guarantee. None of us are guaranteed a life without fear. The idea of security is a myth. None of us get it. And they gathered because they knew there was strength in numbers. They knew they would be stronger together than apart. And what allowed them to do this was their collective knowledge of history, their collective metabolizing of a past of terror. And more than that, that Spaniards had done the hard work of history, right? That they weren't living with the fairy tale version of history. They were remembering their own complicity, their own collective complicity with the Franco regime, remembering how, in an earlier era, they and their parents and grandparents, some of them, had given into that desire for security and given up their democracy in the process. And so because they had done that work of history, they didn't lose their story. They had a story in that moment of crisis. They didn't go into shock. It was shocking, but they didn't go into shock. They had that collective story. And it was history, really, that saved them. So as we think about how we can be shock resistant, we know we can't keep the shocks from coming, but we don't have to regress. We don't have to give in to our fear. We can study history, and that will allow us to recognize patterns instantly. It's our roadmap. And we will see the early warning signs instantly, and we will be able to react, and we'll be able to resist. So I want to thank you very much. I've talked a long time, but we still have time for questions. History is is our story. It's our shock resistance. So thank you for remembering a little bit with me tonight.
You've been listening to a presentation by journalist and author Naomi Klein, talking about her latest book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the program. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author. Her books include the international bestseller, No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies. With over 1 million copies in print, this book, Naomi Klein's first, was translated into 28 languages. And Fences and Windows, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Globalization Debate. Naomi Klein is a regular contributor to The Nation magazine and the British newspaper The Guardian. In 2004, she released The Take, a feature documentary about Argentina's occupied factories, co-produced with director Avi Lewis. And now we return to the question and answer segment from the program. Faced with a long line of people waiting to ask questions, Naomi Klein would listen to 2 or 3 and then address each of the points or questions raised. One of the first questions was why it took so long for Naomi Klein to visit Portland. Another audience member observed that Naomi Klein writes about resistance in other countries, of how people in other countries are fighting to defend themselves. Is this the most we can expect? What can be done at a global level to dismantle the shock doctrine philosophy of privatization? And what can be done to reverse the process, to roll back the victories of disaster capitalism? The next question is about how U.S. history is debated, how events in U.S. history are denied or reinterpreted in radically different ways. Can you comment on the struggle over the facts and interpretation of U.S. history? The next member of the audience asked about racism in the United States. It was, this audience member claimed, the introduction of a National Football League team to New Orleans that started the process of desegregation. With regard to the economic context, this audience member had worked in Saudi Arabia for many years. Working in Saudi Arabia, there was a time when it cost more to put air and water in your car than it did to fill up the tank with gas. It cost 17 cents per barrel to produce the oil, and now it's over $100 a barrel.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to... And I think it's fine for people to make brief comments, because I'm not going to be able to answer all of these questions, as you can see, and I can't answer a lot of these questions. The point about the price of oil, it's something as a Canadian that I've been thinking a lot about, because as you may have heard, the Canadian dollar is on par with yours, or I think it might be a little stronger. And a lot of that is because your economy is tanking, but a lot of it is because Canada is in the midst of a disaster capitalism boom, and that has to do with the fact that we have discovered oil. And we discovered oil because, ironically, because Iraq was invaded. And because Iraq was invaded, the price of oil soared. And, Alan Greenspan has now told us that Iraq was invaded for its oil. But interestingly, they haven't really quite been able to get their hands on that oil yet, although they're doing their best and they're getting a good start in Kurdistan. But because of that instability and the price of oil going so high, in many other parts of the world, you have an oil boom going on that would be economically unfeasible were it not for that instability.